Hi everybody. Today we're going to be looking at some of the differences between different engine configurations when you're running at higher displacements. In particular, we're going to be looking at the V8, the V12, and the V10 engines, since those are the most common choices for any engine above 5 or so liters. So, we'll delve right into it. I've made 3 engines here with a square bore and stroke, that is to say that the bore and stroke values are completely equal to each other, and I got the displacements as close as I could, so we're within about 10 cc's of each other. And we'll go right into it and start looking at the statistics of these engines. So right off the bat here, we can see that the V10 is producing more horsepower, whereas the V8 is producing the most torque. And the V12 seems to be running the mid-ground, with a mid-range of power and the same torque as the V10. So, one of the reasons for this is the V12, with its extra cylinders, has more friction due to the increased amount of pistons rubbing against the cylinder walls. The crankshaft has to deal with more friction from the con rods. So, more cylinders can sometimes mean that you have less power at higher RPMs. The V8, of course, has more torque because less cylinders means a higher stroke per cylinder, since it's all square configurations, and because of the higher stroke, it's outputting more torque. Going into throttle response, it's pretty much the same across the board here, with differences of 0.6, so effectively negligible between all the engine types, which is to be expected because they're all sharing a very similar configuration. Going on to smoothness, this is where we see the biggest difference between the 3 different types of engine configurations. The V8 is a very smooth engine in general, provided that you're running with a standard cross-plane crankshaft, and a value of 61 is quite good. In fact, it's better than you'll get in a V6, really, and it's only really outclassed, other than by the V12 and V10, by the inline 6 engine, and I suppose the V16 if you do have the DLC. The V12 is incredibly smooth. It is the smoothest engine short of the V16 because it is 2 straight 6 engines, already very smooth on their own, but tied together so that they're balancing out all of the disruptions in frequency that cause vibration. So obviously the more cylinders you have in these configurations, the better it gets. An exception to this, however, is the V10 engine. Because of the way that a 90-degree crankshaft operates, for the same reason that a 60-degree V8 isn't smooth, but a 90 is, a 90-degree V10 engine isn't actually very smooth at all. It has a very distinctive offbeat warble. If you listen to the sound of a Dodge Viper, it'll sound very similar to this one, because in order to stabilize it and reduce vibrations, it's called an odd firing order. So the cylinders aren't firing in the expected way that you'd get out of a V8 or a V12. Now there is even firing V10s, but automation doesn't support that, so we won't be going into that at all. But since this is odd firing, it is smoother than the V8, although in theory an even firing V10 would produce more power. Moving on to sound, obviously there's no real difference, so we'll skip past that. Same with reliability. It's effectively the same across the board because these engine configurations are all fairly standard issue. There's nothing odd about them. It's not like they're running with a displacement that's too high or too low for the amount of cylinders that they have. Weight here is something to take note of. The V8 obviously is a big, large cast iron block, so that's going to be the heaviest of them all. Or, sorry, I should say aluminum. I've made all these engines out of aluminum. But the point still stands. The V10, considerably lighter because the block just isn't as massive, either vertically or horizontally. It is longer, but not long enough that it makes up for that. And finally, the V12 is once again taking the mid-ground of the two, because while it's longer like the V10, it does have a 60-degree angle, meaning that, as we discussed in the other video, it is actually heavier due to this section right around in the middle where the different banks meet, right under the injectors. That adds quite a bit of weight. But it's all fairly similar to each other, so it's not the biggest thing to worry about. But it could make a difference in a hypercar or a supercar using the V10 over, say, a V8. Fuel efficiency, obviously same across the board, same with octane. Interestingly, the V8 emits more, and I've looked through everything to try and find out why that is, but I can't seem to figure it out. Maybe just the larger cylinders mean that it can consume more petrol, and that's what's causing that? I'm not sure. I would have to look into it. So, that doesn't really explain, though, why the V10 emits less than the V12. So, it's quite confusing, honestly, and I don't have a straight-up answer for that. I'm hoping to figure that out maybe another time. Moving on to production units, obviously the V8 is an extremely simple engine. They've been using this configuration for almost a century now, so it's no surprise that it's the easiest to produce out of the three. And then the V10 comes in second place because it really just is a lengthened V8. There's nothing particularly special about it other than the odd firing order, so it's not that noteworthy, but it is a substantial increase of 11 production units. And then another 11 production unit gap to the V12, just due to the sheer size and complexity of everything from the headers to the injectors on this. It's going to take more time to develop. And prices are pretty similar across the board too. The kind of cars you'll be putting these large engines into, it shouldn't really matter that difference of, what's that, 72? $72 dollars per unit between the V8, the least expensive, and the V12, the most. So I wouldn't be too preoccupied with the cost of using a V12 configuration if you're so inclined. So let's delve right into now the specifics of how the engines are working. And first we'll start off on the V8. So looking at the V8 right now, we can see, that's no small torque number. You wouldn't want to scoff at that. But what I'm also seeing is a beautifully shaped torque curve, almost like a rainbow shape to it. And what this means is that when you apply a steady throttle, you're going to get steady performance. There's no jumps, there's no bumps, it doesn't waver. It's perfect, very easy to control, very easy to handle. We'll go into here, and I'll just show you everything that all the engines are going to be running. All the engines have a cat converter, high flow 3-way with a single baffled muffler. The exhaust diameter is all the same, and I did double check, and that is the correct exhaust diameter to run on all of these. I didn't make it the same just so they were all, perfectly equal. I did try and tune these a bit properly. Headers are all long tubular, dual exhaust as well. Coming into here, every one of them uses a 14.2 fuel mixture and a fully advanced ignition timing, as well as premium fuel, a performance intake, and a single direct injection fuel system. And of course they're naturally aspirated, and with a cam profile of 40. And then lightweight forged pistons, conrods, and forged steel crankshaft, just so that we don't have to worry about anything like high RPM stress or too much stress from over torquing. Now, the lightweight forged pistons do actually decrease the octane value, so you'll need to use these pistons if you're going to be trying to replicate the results I got here. And I'm going to note as well, the compression ratio of the V8 is 10.3 to 1, which is a fair value. Not particularly high nowadays, when a lot of manufacturers are running 10.5, 11, 3.5, 11.5, not 3.5, dear lord, no. So, that's what I would consider a good value. And, I didn't increase the fuel mixture like crazy or mess around with the ignition timing to compression ratio too much, because I want these to all be fairly similar. That's the point I'm trying to make here. I'm not trying to tune any of these just perfectly. So, we've taken a look at this torque curve here, the horsepower curve. Everything, because of that smooth torque curve, is right about perfect. Let's back out now, and we're going to take a look at the second engine, the V10, the bigger brother to the V8 engine. Again with a 6-liter displacement, and everything throughout here is the same. Taking a look at this torque curve here, it's a similar rainbow shape, but it does seem to be pushed over a little bit to the right. You're producing a little bit more torque at high RPMs. Not a lot. You probably wouldn't notice the difference in reality. It might mean you could edge out another, 2-3 miles an hour, depending on the type of car you're running. But it's not such a drastic difference. But what that does mean is that it explains why the V10 engine produces more horsepower. Because even though the red line is the same at 6,200 RPM, because of the increased torque, and horsepower is a function of torque and time, there you go. Other than that, I don't see anything particularly noteworthy about the torque or horsepower curves on this. Everything's quite smooth. There's a little bump and divot here, but it's within a single pound-foot of torque, so it's nothing to be worried about. It might make a larger difference if you're tuning it for quite high RPMs, where there is a big difference between torque from, a few hundred RPMs difference, but that's not something we have to worry about right now. And finally, the V12 engine. Just taking a look at here, I'm actually seeing the torque curve is right around the same as the V8 engine, but almost steeper at the low range. This part here is, at least if I'm recalling correctly, quite a bit sharper than the V8 engine is. So this engine will produce better torque up to, about 3,000 RPM than the V8 is, before they get roughly equal. And I'm also seeing kind of a bumpy horsepower and torque function right after the peak horsepower here. So that's not really ideal. You generally want it flatter or a steadier curve, but that's not really something I'll get worked up about. But it does mean I'm probably shifting at about 6,100 RPM instead of 6,200 if I'm going for perfect 0 to 60. Alright, and through here we can see the compression on the V12 is actually higher than that of both the V8 and the V10 at 10.5 to 1. Now, that's not a very big difference, but it could explain the increased low-end torque, although maybe not explain the different curvature on the low end. I believe that there is just a product of how the V12 engine with its 60-degree crank pin angle operates. And finally, we'll back out of this here, and we'll take a look at one of the most important values in looking at a luxury car. Now, any of you who have bought a second-hand luxury car in real life will know that the upkeep on them can be quite measurable. Old 911s, even like a 944, 924 Turbo, Jaguar, XKS, I believe they call it, the XJS, there we go. They're quite known for their terrible upkeep costs and the fact that it's pretty hard for the average person to afford to keep it, even if they can afford to purchase it. So, we're going to be taking a look at service costs. The V8, $577.4 a year, which it's a lot. That's a lot of money to put into an engine every year. Reliability value is fine, but just due to the higher displacement, higher complexity of the engine, that's to be expected. Now, moving on to the V10, we can see it increase a little bit to $605.5 a year, which seems quite proportional, honestly, compared to the V8. I'm not surprised at all that adding 2 extra cylinders does increase the maintenance cost. Finally, we have the V12, which is quite a bit higher in service cost, actually. There's a difference of about $60 per year just between these two, which doesn't sound like a lot, But when you're also dealing with your bodywork, your driveline, your wheels, everything like that, that can make all the difference. So, I would suggest that you're using the V12 only in more expensive trims, really, of cars. Now, we'll move on to which engine you should be using in which type of car. The V8 is obviously a classic in muscle cars, sports cars, even some supercars use them. But it's not necessarily the most powerful engine configuration, and it can't rev as high as the other two, running at the same displacement, just due to the fact that you're limited by the higher stroke you're going to need to use. So for the V8, I would recommend that you use it for any muscle car or sports car, regardless of year, that you desire that much power in. Now a straight 6 or a V6 is a perfectly fine option, but a V8 is a good idea, especially for an American make, or a German sports car like a BMW M5 or some sort of Mercedes. The V10, I would exclusively use this in high-end sports cars, supercars, and hypercars. There isn't much a reason to use one compared to the V8, where you can stick that in an older full-size sedan or something, because by the time this is available, it's just guzzling too much gas, and the power isn't really all that necessary unless you're going for those extreme high-performance engines. In addition, I've found that when tuning the V10 compared to the V12 engines for extreme performance, the V10 is almost always able to edge out several hundred horsepower and torque more than the V12. I assume this is due to the lower rotational mass of the engine, but I can't be quite sure how automation calculates that. Finally, we're taking a look at the V12. Now, this is a great choice for older cars especially. If you need a GT model that needs a higher trim from the V8 that you've got on the base spec, this is a great choice. Older supercars all used V12s, or more rarely V8s, like I believe the Ferrari Dino used a V8 engine. And it's also a good choice on a modern luxury car if you're really pushing the higher end markets like an AMG. But keep in mind that Rolls-Royce got by for the longest time on their Rolls-Royce V8 engine. That was beautiful. So the V12 might be a good choice due to its smoothness, but don't forget the added complexity and greatly increased production unit cost of using such a thing. Probably best left to smaller production cars, or once again, older sports supercars, Grand Tours, that sort of thing. So, I hope that you guys found this video informative, and I'm hoping that it'll help you with your car designing processes in the future. I hope you guys enjoyed this, and have a good day.